Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that mainstream media pundits hate him so much they may cover him more negatively than former President Donald Trump. Let's watch.
It's interesting to me because I've been really, slammed in a way that I think is unprecedented, even more than President Trump was slammed by the mainstream, by the corporate media.
May have a point there. He also added this.
This Harris-Harvard poll came out, which is a gold standard poll, I think 2,500 people yesterday. It showed that my popularity is greater than by I think 20 points and any other political candidate. So somehow the American people are hearing what I'm saying. I don't know whether it's through the podcast or through social media. My unfavorability ratings should be off the charts if people believe. I mean, listen, if I believe the stuff that's written about me in the papers and reported about me on the mainstream news sites, I would not have anything. I would definitely not vote for me, and I would not, I would think I was a very despicable person.
A New York Times write-up of RFK Jr.'s testimony on Capitol Hill last week earned ire online. One passage reads, "Despite the theater, the hearing raised thorny questions about free speech in a democratic society. Is misinformation protected by the First Amendment? When is it appropriate for the federal government to seek to tamp down the spread of falsehoods?" Meanwhile, progressive PACs seem to be fundraising off of the push to kick RFK Jr. off of the Democratic primary ballot. It's an interesting comment from the New York Times.
What a question. Yeah. How will we ever, figure out if misinformation is protected by the First Amendment? Oh, wait a minute, it is. We know that.
The New York Times has been protected. They published a bunch of articles by Judith Miller saying Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi president at the time, had materials to develop bombs. And what did that do? Oh, it ended up leading us into the Iraq War.
Nice clapback. Absolutely correct. Yes, misinformation is not a designated category. It's a category, by the way, the media has just kind of invented or absorbed from from national security analysis of enemy information, what's misinformation, what's disinformation. This is not a category of speech that the Supreme Court has designated as off limits for protection, nor is hate speech a category that's been designated by the Supreme Court as off limits for protection. The Supreme Court is very speech affirming and has recognized a small number of exceptions, libel, fighting words, imminent calls to actual violence, not just violent rhetoric, but specific, we're going to kill this person at this time and here's how we'll do it. That is not protected. But saying things that are not accurate or exaggerated or wrong in whatever ways is absolutely constitutionally protected. It has to be, because the New York Times, as you said, gets stuff wrong, and so does all sorts of other people, and it is protected. And I don't know how they can still be in this framing that we need the government to stop people from saying things that are wrong when they got so much wrong with respect to, as you pointed out, national security matters in the past and recently, and also various things relating to COVID. But that is their mindset, that misinformation literally needs to be policed.
Yes, it's rich coming from the mainstream media. That somehow your misinformation is different from my regular propaganda. Mm-hmm. What will we have left as a nation if propaganda is not covered as part of free speech? We'd have no media to consume. It would be a desolate Twitter space where it would just be Matt Walsh tweeting about his kids fishing with sticks and catching fish instead of being on TikTok doing dances. There would be nothing interesting to watch or listen to. Mainstream media would go bankrupt because of the litany of lawsuits that they would have to fight. I mean, Fox News just had the lawsuit, which was settled, right, with Dominion voting. That was something that was not just misinformation, right? It was.
Well, that was libel.
It was libel.
That's what they were accused of, and they settled.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
That's a different situation. The kind of regular bias the media has, not only in choosing what stories they cover, but how they cover and what facts they include, it could be argued as all misinformation. Yeah. Misinformation is not the same thing as explicitly reporting lies or falsehoods for an explicit purpose. Misinformation is such a gray area that imagine trying to legally define it or argue it in court. It just doesn't make sense, and it's rich that this came precisely from the New York Times.
The New York Times said that their lead coronavirus reporter, Apurva Mandavili, tweeted that the lab leak was a racist conspiracy theory. That was misinformation. And now it's, again, not settled definitively, but there's more evidence that indicates in that way. Certain government agencies have concluded it's the more likely explanation. It's no longer considered misinformation to discuss it. So that, there's so many cases. This is the textbook "Who watches the Watchmen" kind of thing. We understand, and it's part of the classic liberal, and even until very recently, the progressive liberal approach and left approach was that you need robust protections for free speech, because you can't, if you put people in charge of deciding what you can say, those people will have their own biases. They'll get it wrong sometimes, and it's better to allow people to say things that might not be true than to inadvertently and accidentally criminalize necessary, important speech, the way governments have done throughout all of human history. When it was illegal to criticize the king or the religious authorities, or even our own government did, despite the First Amendment during, World War I, for instance, when people who objected to that were actually jailed. That's not what we do anymore. In keeping with the liberal approach, the broad liberal, the classically liberal, Enlightenment liberal approach to speech, and as you said, the New York Times itself has benefited from that, and now they're trying to overturn it because they don't like Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Right, and they're like, well, if we say that what he's saying is misinformation, we tamp down on it, we can quell his candidacy. We can make it so that people never hear from him, never hear his ideas. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made the good point that he has had high favorability ratings in the polls. So he believes people are hearing what he's saying through social media or podcasts outside of the mainstream media. I think people have more mistrust in the mainstream media when they try and push out candidates like RFK Jr. before they hear from him. And so the way he draws the distinction between him and Trump, saying that they hate him so much more than they hated Trump and perhaps are giving him more negative coverage, that negative coverage doesn't need to explicitly be he's the worst guy ever. They actually showed a lot of Trump's speeches and what Trump was saying. They're not showing a lot of RFK Jr. speeches and what he's saying, and that can really impact his candidacy. So that statement might have some merit. He might be in Trump's crosshairs by saying he's better at Trump than something, so now Trump might pick a fight with him. But I think he makes a really good point there. They're not saying like he's a despicable person. They're just not really covering his campaign as they should. And when they do, they've explicitly said we're intentionally not covering it because we don't like him.
There's a long history of considering, of the mainstream media treating the next big thing on the right as so much scarier than the previous thing. Even though, and RFK Jr., by the way, of course, running for the Democratic nomination, not running as a Republican, although he does, and there are many Democrats who like him, many independents who like him, there are libertarians who like him, and there are a lot of Republicans who like him. So he is like running this campaign to appeal to all sorts of people, but the mainstream media is treating him as a conservative figure. He was invited by Republicans to testify before Congress last week. Democrats not only opposed it, but took active steps during the hearing to stop him from being able to speak. Those failed, thank goodness. But anyway, they're treating him, yes, as a greater threat than Trump, and then Trump himself was treated as, more appalling and evil and villainous than George W. Bush by the media. George W. Bush was treated as more appalling and villainous and scary than, his father or Reagan. It's just like the next big bad wolf is always scarier than the previous one.
The last thing I'll say on this is he's very diplomatic in what he said here in the video we played, that if he believed the stuff that's written about him in the papers and reported about him in mainstream sites, he wouldn't have any people willing to vote for him. Like, he would think he was a despicable person if he read that stuff. So he's very politely saying, mainstream media, nobody believes you. Nobody believes what you're writing. And he does it pretty eloquently, very diplomatic.
Indeed. Well, we'll have more Rising right after this.